Fellow Americans, I want to warn you about reverse psychology and what you really need to watch out for in the situation in the United States today. So who am I? I'm a Swedish American. I lived many years in Miami, and while I lived there, I helped the Venezuelan resistance in Operación Libertad Venezuela, and I founded an NGO called Fuerza de Paz Venezuela. This was our identifier, the blue beret, and it was activated in the border zone in Cucuta in 2019. And then the pandemic came and it got dismantled. But since 2011, actually 2009, I've been following what's going on. And if you remember, back then, a lot of people believed that Venezuela was a democracy. In 2002, the people did a popular uprising. 1 million people marched on the presidential palace. And I was one of those who believed that that was kind of not correct because of what I heard in media here in Sweden. Now, things are not what they seem to be. Now, what I found when I studied this was that when Hugo Chavez was elected in the end of 1998, he got installed in January 1999, and he very quickly converted Venezuela into a dictatorship, but in such a way that it wasn't obvious for the majority, or at least countries like Sweden and in Europe didn't report on it. Media didn't report on it. The United States did. What I found later, when I came back to Sweden, I'll jump now to 2000. I moved here when the pandemic came. In the US, I was in a zone where there was a lot of crime. People were spying on me daily. I didn't know if it was the Venezuelan regime, their Cuban allies, or if it was a criminal group smuggling drugs called cocaine, because I could see they were doing that. Later, the FBI made arrests and it turned out to be Tren de Aragua. But anyway, I needed to arm myself. I'm a pacifist, really. I'm against guns, but I had to. And I got a concealed carry license. And when I had guns, this is a toy just, but when I had guns, I used them to help the Venezuelan resistance, to test materials for making shields, to protect themselves against those rubber bullets and real bullets the regime were firing against them. When I moved to Sweden, here I have a farm, so I need a rifle for hunting. So I applied for bringing some of the guns that I thought would be useful here. And I mentioned in the application that I had been testing material to protect against police forces in Venezuela, and that I would like to continue to do that in Sweden. Guess what the police did? They did not evaluate the application for the individual weapons. Instead, they evaluated me as a person to own weapons and concluded, the security police concluded, that I was not a suitable person to have a weapon. And when I appealed it to the court, and I asked for specifically to hold court hearings and not determine it on the papers like they normally do, guess what they did? They locked the door. They locked me out. And they did not allow witnesses. They did not allow a public. And then they listened to secret evidence from the police that was not in the decision from the court. And the appeal, obviously, denied. And when I was waiting outside, I said, this is strange. It has the hour has come and they haven't opened the door. And the lawyer, and I commented to a lawyer who was out there who knew about the case. And I said, I really wanted to have a lawyer to help me, but I couldn't find any who would take it. And he said, no, and you will never find one. And I said, why? And he came up with the stupidest excuse. Oh, because they feel bad charging you $900 for it. If you believe that, I have a terrain to sell you in the Amazon rainforest. What has happened here in Sweden, and this is an important lesson for you in the US, is that they have all the lawyers under their thumbs. You cannot get a lawyer in Sweden to help you in a case like this. So that's the end game in the US, to create a country where it seems that everything is peaceful. Oh, well, let me take another example. In 2023, I went to Colombia, back to the border in Cúcuta where we had helped the refugees. And I took a trip around to look outside the city, and I was stopped by the ELN guerrilla. I wasn't there to spy on them, but that's what I thought I was. So they took me hostage, and then they brought me into Venezuela. I was interrogated by people, a person who works for the regime. And by the way, he told me point blank, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba are in their revolution, and we in ELN are revolutionaries. ELN is the Ejército de Liberación Nacional of Colombia, a guerrilla formed in 1964, and the only one in Latin America that has not yet signed a peace deal. So they are together, and they told me, oh, we are not smuggling, we are not in the cocaine business, but I could observe a thing or two myself. They are obviously in it. And earlier this year, they started a war against another FARC that went back into the business of cocaine smuggling. And they told me, ELN told me, that they had given a terrain to FARC there. But FARC apparently stole a container full of cocaine from them. So they started a war and killed about 80 FARC members. And now they're expanding in that territory and driving out a lot of people. But that's a whole other story. For some reason that nobody understands, at least of all FBI who interviewed me afterwards, is why they let me live. But they did. And I think probably it was for personal reasons. So anyway, I'm here to tell the story. And the horrific thing about this is they told me that they were in peace negotiations and the Swedish government was involved. And the Swedish government did not want to say anything here to the media about my kidnapping. And if I would have Googled it, I would never have found out. But since they told me, I started investigating, and it turns out, yes, they are. Folke Bernadotte-akademin. Sweden is involved under the radar. Norway is giving the face, but Sweden is under the radar. And also, from intelligence information that I've got, because we've done a lot of intelligence studying about this, high people in the Swedish government, in the foreign department, have been very close to these people in Caracas who are the leaders of the world cocaine cartel. And I recently got a book from Bo Teutenberg, who was an intelligence officer in Sweden, and he tells that same story in that book that came out in 2023 about the Olof Palme murder. It's in Swedish, though. I made a video about it. You can see maybe the translation here, subtitles. So that's a big detour, but getting back to the point. When I was telling this story and some parts of it, new revelations, to a Swedish newspaper that had written a lot about my disappearance, the editor did not allow it to be published. He came up with an excuse, but that was just an excuse so the journalist wouldn't understand that it really was a firm no. And I think the reason was that I said straight out in that article that I had been held in Venezuela and they were involved in cocaine trafficking. Because here in Sweden, it's not politically correct for media to say that Venezuela is in cocaine trafficking. If you start looking, you'll see that that does not appear. It's been silenced, even though it's been going on for decades. So here in Sweden, we are in a country where there is not freedom of expression and there is not real rule of law. And that is what happens when you let go of your liberties drop by drop. Now back to the thing that I started with, reverse psychology. We have the riots in Los Angeles. And a lot of people are saying, the obvious thing, Trump has been preparing this So they conclude that Trump wants the violence, and therefore we should refrain. Pardon me, I need to take a break. So I'm back. I was running low on coffee in my veins. Well, as I was saying, reverse psychology. Trump has been signaling that he is going to deploy the National Guard, that he is going to crack down hard. Now, why has he been signaling that? Think about that. My thinking is that he wants to make people believe that that is his plan, so that people will take off the table the option of using force. However, let's look at the case of Venezuela. After all these years, I've been inside the resistance. I've come to the conclusion that there is no way to defeat the regime without the use of force. Because that's a Carter regime. The hardcore supporters fervently believe in the cause, and they do not fight for money. They fight for conviction. And they are prepared to use whatever force needed, including genocide. Yes! The reason the fight was called off was because we realized, I calculated that 5 million people would die of starvation within 18 months. And we called for retreat. And it's better, I said, to flee and live to fight another day and not end up like the Ukrainians in 1932. My grandfather, who bought this farm, he was in Ukraine. He saw the genocide there, the Holodomor. And I was determined not to allow that to happen again in Venezuela. And that is why there are so many millions of Venezuelans who have fled the country. And that is why there are so many hundreds of thousands, if not millions of Venezuelans in the United States now that Trump is trying to evict. These are people who have fled genocide. Genocide. Because they couldn't free their country and no other nation would help them. They tried. In 2002, there were 1 million strong on the streets of Caracas demanding the resignation of Hugo Chavez, and he resigned. But 2 days later, he was reinstated in a military coup d'etat by General Baruel, who, fate will have it, would later be imprisoned by Hugo Chavez himself and die in prison. Do not ever cooperate with these fascists. And by the way, when I say fascist, communist, it's the same thing. Two sides of the same coin. Never cooperate with them. Infinite resistance. It's better to die standing than to live on your knees. And remember that in the United States. Let me get back now to the topic of reverse psychology. Trump wants you to take force off the table because he knows that the use of force is the only thing that can threaten his takeover of power in the United States and converting the United States into a country like China. Or Russia in the worst case. Or Venezuela. It's on the way. I mean, the economy of the United States is tanking. Those who support him believe, oh, now the US will go to a bright future. On the contrary, Venezuela was once the fourth richest country in the world, and it turned into the poorest on the Western Hemisphere and one of the 2-3 poorest in the world due to this revolution. That is what is expecting for the United States. Now, let me take another parenthesis here. Everybody is screwing everything in here. This is one thing that Donald Trump really has in common with Epstein, screwing everybody. Donald Trump is screwing the American people who voted for him. And the Koch brothers who gave him the money in order to this and stopped resisting him, they did that on the condition that they could name the judges, the magistrates and so. But they are screwing Trump because on the final decision to make Trump a dictator, the Supreme Court is stopping him. However, they are also being screwed because Trump is destroying the US economy. So they can sit there with their billions of increasingly worthless money. It hasn't really started tanking yet, the dollar, but it will. And who is screwing everybody at the end? Vladimir Putin. Because the one thing he and she fear most of all is a free, democratic country in the world, a beacon of freedom of democracy. And that is what the United States has been up until now. And that threatens their hold on power. That's why they want to destroy the United States. This is the most serious situation you have faced, and I, being a Swedish American, I'm a US citizen too now, since the Civil War, and perhaps even more serious. So don't take anything off the table. I read a good article. I actually discussed it with the guerrilla in Colombia, Venezuela, because they said, oh, they call us terrorists. They were angry at me because I had called them terrorists. And I said, but it says so in Wikipedia that you have been declared terrorists by the European Union and the United States. They couldn't say much about that. But I told them about a good article I read from a university up in the Northeast about the difference between a terrorist and a freedom fighter. And there are certain criteria that a freedom fighter, because a revolution is allowed under international law. But there are certain criteria. It has to be against a legitimately bad regime that commits really bad acts, and it has to be backed up by the majority of the people. And if the majority of the people are not aware of the real facts, that they would have backed it if they had known the real facts, if they had not been brainwashed by media and propaganda. And then there are some more conditions. The acts of violence have to be against the regime and those who defend the regime, not against private property, or you can't put a bomb to sow out terror. That's terrorism. It has to be legitimately against the regime. And also, you can't go and murder the head of state unless it is done as a part of a generalized freedom fight. So don't take anything off the table, but also don't start anything that you don't know that you can win. That's an essential rule of war. So at the present point of the struggle, the thing to do now is to have non-violent actions. Massive, centric, sustained. Those are key things. It has to be centric, it has to be massive, it has to be sustained. Eventually, the regime will start to crumble, and they will resort to violence. And that is when it's legitimate to do things in self-defense. This was done in Venezuela. Everything that was done there was done in self-defense, and the regime was the one committing the violence acts and starting all the violence. So, back to the point of origin, the reverse psychology. When Trump signaled that he was going to create havoc in order to use the Insurrection Act and put militaries on the street, that was in order to make people take force off the table. But do not take force off the table. Trump wants you to take the use of force off the table, but that cannot and should not ever be off the table, because it is legitimate against a regime like the one Donald Trump is leading.